All stories are dramatized recreations. Named locations are fictionalized. Any resemblance to real persons is coincidental.
Hi, I'm Olivia, a 38-year-old waitress from California. Sharing this is hard, but I need to process how my husband Mark's affair with a female coworker shattered our 11-year marriage. It began when the smallest, most insignificant detail started to glow like a neon sign in the dark, a sign I had been blindly passing by for months. It was a Thursday, I think. The days had started to blur into a comfortable, predictable haze of work, home, and sleep. My life was a series of routines, and I found a strange comfort in that. Mark and I had settled into a rhythm that felt like safety. We knew each other's coffee orders, the TV shows we'd watch together, the side of the bed we each claimed. It was a quiet life, but it was ours. Or so I thought. The discovery wasn't dramatic. There was no lipstick on his collar, no perfumed letter falling from a pocket. It was a name he mentioned with a frequency that was just a hair too often, with a lightness in his tone that felt new. Chloe from work. Chloe from work had a funny story about a client. Chloe from work thought that new movie was overrated. Chloe from work recommended this great podcast. It was always casual, always dropped into conversation like a harmless garnish. I didn't think much of it, why would I? He had female coworkers. I had male coworkers. We were adults. We were married. We had a history that felt like an impenetrable fortress. But then the fortress walls began to show cracks. Small, almost invisible ones. He started working later. Not every night, but once a week, then twice. A big project, he'd say, texting me from the office with a sad face emoji. Chloe and I are just swamped. We're trying to get this wrapped up. I believe him. I leave a plate of food for him in the microwave, and sometimes he'd eat it, sometimes he wouldn't. He became distracted at home, his phone always face down on the arm of the couch, a new passcode on the screen. When I asked about it, he laughed it off. Oh, it made us all update our security. You know how it is. I did know. Or I thought I did. I told myself I was being paranoid, that this was what long-term marriage was, a comfortable erosion of passion, replaced by a deep, steady trust. I held on to that trust like a life raft. The neon sign finally lit up one evening when he left his Apple Watch on the bathroom sink while he showered. It buzzed with a notification. I wasn't going to look. I truly wasn't, but the screen lit up and the preview of the message was just there, unavoidable. A text from Chloe. Not about work. It was a heart emoji, a single pink heart. And underneath it, the beginning of her next message. Can't wait to see you two more. The world didn't stop. It didn't shatter. It just tilted. Everything I knew, every assumption I had, slid slowly off the edge of that tiny screen. The water was still running in the shower. Steam fogged the mirror. And I just stood there, holding on to the edge of the sink, staring at that glowing, beating heart. A heart that was not meant for me. The sound of the shower shut off. The sudden silence in the bathroom was louder than any noise. I could hear the drip of the faucet, the thud of my own heart. I placed the watch back on the counter, exactly as I had found it. My hands were shaking. I wiped them on my jeans, took a deep breath that did nothing to calm me, and walked out of the bathroom. I moved through the hallway on autopilot, my mind a chaotic static. What was I supposed to do? Scream? Cry? Throw something? All those reactions felt like they belonged to someone else, to a character in a movie. I felt numb, a hollowed-out shell walking into the living room just as he emerged from the hallway, a towel around his waist, his hair wet. "Hey," he said, smiling. He had that relaxed, post-shower ease about him. He walked toward the kitchen. "I'm starving. Is there any of that pasta left?" He was already opening the refrigerator door, completely oblivious to the bomb that had just detonated inside me, to the fact that the woman he was talking to was just a ghost of the wife he had left an hour ago. My voice, when it finally came, didn't sound like my own. It was flat, eerily calm. Who is Chloe? The question hung in the air between us, simple and devastating. He froze, his hand on the refrigerator door handle. I saw the muscles in his back tense. It was just a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in his composure, but it was all the confirmation I needed. He closed the fridge door slowly and turned around, his expression a careful mask of confusion. "Chloe, from work. Why? She texted you." On your watch. I kept my arms crossed, holding myself together. A heart. She sent you a heart, Mark. And she can't wait to see you tomorrow. The mask slipped. I saw it, a flash of panic in his eyes before he looked away, running a hand through his damp hair. Oh, that. Olivia, it's not what you think. It's how we talk. It's a work thing. She's like that with everyone. It's just a joke. A joke. I repeated the words, tasting their absurdity. A joke. For 11 months? A year? However long this has been going on. I hadn't known the timeline until that moment, but the words felt true as I said them. This wasn't new, nothing is going on, he said, his voice rising defensively. He took a step toward me, but I took a step back. The movement was small, but it made him stop. The hurt on his face looked so real. You're being paranoid. You're reading into things because you're bored, because you're always here alone. Don't, I cut him off, the numbness finally giving way to a sharp, clean anger. Don't you dare try to turn this on me. Don't you dare tell me I'm bored. I saw it. I saw the message. Look me in the eye and tell me, right now, that there is nothing inappropriate between you and Chloe. Tell me you haven't lied to me about working late. Tell me you haven't been with her when you said you were at the office. He opened his mouth, and for a second, I thought he would lie. I saw the calculation in his eyes, the desperate scramble for a story that would fit. But he saw the certainty in mine. The fight went out of him. His shoulders slumped, and he looked down at the floor. The silence that followed was worse than any lie. It was an admission. It was the sound of our marriage breaking. It just happened, he whispered, finally. The cliché of it was like a physical blow. We were working so close together on this project, it was intense. It didn't mean anything. It was a mistake. A mistake. Is that what you call it? A mistake is adding salt instead of sugar to a recipe. A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill. This was 1,000 conscious choices. Every text message sent, every lie told, every time you chose to stay with her and leave me here alone. Each one was a choice. You didn't trip and fall into her bed, Mark. You walked. You chose to walk away from us. I didn't say any of that. The words were trapped in my throat, a tangled mess of pain and fury. I just stared at him, at the man I had shared a bed with for 11 years, who now felt like a complete stranger. The man who had promised me a lifetime of boring, beautiful Thursdays. I turned and walked away from him. I went into our bedroom, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. I pulled an old suitcase from the top of the closet. I started with my own drawers, my own side of the closet. I couldn't bear to touch his things. The act of packing was mechanical, a necessary task to keep my mind from fully comprehending the abyss that had just opened up beneath my feet. He stood in the doorway, watching me, saying nothing. His silence was the final nail in the coffin. There were no pleas, no grand apologies. Just the heavy, shameful quiet of a man who had been caught. I zipped the suitcase closed. It wasn't full, I didn't need much. I walked past him, out of the bedroom, through the living room, and out the front door. I got into my car, put the key in the ignition, and drove. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay there for another second. The life I had known was in the rearview mirror, getting smaller and smaller until I turned a corner, and it was gone. The first week was a blur of muted colors and hollow sounds. I rented a small, furnished studio apartment on the other side of town. It smelled of stale air and industrial cleaner, a sharp, impersonal scent that was nothing like the home we had built. The silence there was different. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of two people who knew each other deeply. It was a loud, oppressive emptiness that echoed in my ears. I didn't cry much. The tears felt like they had frozen somewhere deep inside me, a solid block of ice in my chest. I moved through the days like a ghost, performing the bare minimum of living. I called my manager at the diner and told him I had a family emergency. My voice sounded robotic, even to me. He gave me a week off, no questions asked. Grief, I quickly learned, is not a linear process. It doesn't follow the neat stages they talk about in books. It's a chaotic, messy swirl of emotions that hits you at random moments. One minute I would feel nothing, a complete and utter numbness, and the next, a wave of anger would crash over me so intense it left me breathless. I'd be washing a single cup in the sink, and suddenly I'd want to throw it against the wall just to hear something break. But I didn't. I just placed it carefully on the drying rack. The bizarre grief stages began. I started having intense imaginary conversations with Mark in the empty studio. I'd argue with him in the shower, delivering perfect, eloquent speeches that I could never muster in person. I'd defend myself against his accusations of boredom, listing every sacrifice, every quiet moment of support I had given him over the years. The toaster became my confidant. I'd stare at my warped, sad reflection in its chrome surface while waiting for my plain bagel to pop up, and I'd whisper, "What do I do now?" The silence that followed was my only answer. I didn't burn his things. They were still in the house I had fled, but I did something else. I started a ritual. Every night, at exactly 3 a.m., I'd wake up, my mind jolted awake by an anxiety I couldn't name. Instead of trying to fight it, I gave in. I'd get out of bed, turn on the small lamp in the corner, and I'd learn to breakdance. Or at least, my version of it. I'd find the most aggressive, pounding electronic music on my phone, put on my headphones, and just move. It wasn't dancing, it was a desperate, flailing physical rebellion against the pain. I'd spin on the cheap rug until I was dizzy, I'd kick my legs out, I'd throw my arms around, trying to shake the feeling of betrayal out of my muscles. I'd collapse on the floor, breathless, the music still throbbing in my ears, and for those few minutes, I didn't have to think. I just had to feel the ache in my body instead of the one in my heart. My diet consisted of things that required no effort. For dinner, a handful of crackers for lunch, coffee for breakfast. The world outside my studio window kept turning. People going to work, laughing with friends, living their lives, and I felt completely disconnected from all of it. I was an island of grief in a sea of normalcy. I avoided my phone. It was a repository of a life that no longer existed. Photos of us, text threads filled with his lies, well-meaning but painful messages from friends who had heard whispers of what happened. I couldn't face them yet. To talk about it would make it real, and I was still clinging to the hope that I would wake up from this nightmare. The worst moments were the quiet ones in the afternoon, when the sun would stream through the blinds and highlight the dust particles floating in the air. I'd sit on the floor, leaning against the couch, and just watch them dance. In those moments, the emptiness was overwhelming. Daisy, a media. I wasn't a wife anymore. I wasn't part of a couple. After 11 years, my identity had been so intertwined with his that I had no idea who I was on my own. I was just Olivia, a 38-year-old waitress, sitting on a scratchy carpet in a silent room, trying to remember how to breathe. The future was a terrifying, blank page, and I had no pen, no idea what story to write on it. All I could do was get through 1 hour, then the next, waiting for the ice in my chest to finally melt. The turning point didn't arrive with a bang or a sudden epiphany. It was a slow, quiet dawning, like the sun finally breaking through a weeks-long storm. It started with the plant. A pathetic, half-dead succulent I had bought on a whim at the grocery store, just to have something alive in the room with me. I'd been neglecting it just like I'd been neglecting myself. Its leaves were wrinkled and brown at the tips. One afternoon, during my usual session of watching dust particles, my gaze fell on it. A simple thought cut through the fog in my brain. It's still trying to live. I dragged myself off the floor, filled a glass with water, and gave it a drink. It was such a small, insignificant act, but it was an action. It was a choice to nurture something instead of watching it die. That small act of care for the plant created a tiny crack in the wall of my grief. The next day, I didn't just give it water, I moved it to the spot where the sun hit best in the mornings. I wiped the dust off its leaves. It was still a scraggly thing, but it was my scraggly thing. The ice in my chest began to thaw, not all at once, but drip by drip. The tears finally came, not the frantic, panicked sobs of the first night, but a deep, steady river of release. I cried for the past, for the future I thought I had, for the woman I used to be. I cried until I was empty, and for the first time, that emptiness felt clean instead of hollow. I looked around my sterile, rented studio and realized I couldn't live in this half-life anymore. Mark had made his choices, but I was still making mine. And I was choosing to sit on the floor and eat ice cream for dinner. Okay, enough of this, I thought. The thought wasn't angry or dramatic. It was a simple, firm decision. It was time to rally. I started small. I went to a proper grocery store and bought real food vegetables, chicken, ingredients for a meal that required more than just opening a lid. I cooked myself dinner. The simple act of chopping an onion, of smelling garlic sizzling in a pan, felt profoundly human. It was a reclamation of a basic skill, a tiny declaration that I was still here. I ate at the small table, without the TV on, and I tasted every single bite. The breakdancing at 3 a.m. stopped. Instead, I started going for walks. Just around the block at first, then further. I put on my headphones, but this time I listened to podcasts about history, about science, about anything that would fill my mind with new information instead of the same old, painful loops. I started noticing things again. The way a certain house always had beautifully tended roses, the friendly golden retriever that always watched me from a window, the changing light of the California autumn. I knew I needed to do more than just walk and cook. I needed to remember who I was before I was Mark's wife. In a box of old things I'd dragged from the house, I found it, a sketchbook from my early 20s, filled with clumsy drawings of flowers and patterns. I had loved it once, this quiet, useless hobby. I had abandoned it because life got busy, because it didn't seem important. I drove to an art supply store and bought a new sketchbook, a set of good pencils, and some watercolors. That night, instead of staring at the walls, I opened the book to a fresh page and I drew my succulent. It was wobbly and out of proportion, but it was a start. I was creating something again, instead of just mourning what was destroyed. It was a montage of small victories. Doing a load of laundry and actually folding it. Calling a friend back and saying, "I'm not okay, but I'm getting there," booking a shift at the diner. Each action was a brick I was using to rebuild myself, a new foundation built not on being part of a couple, but on being a whole person on my own. The woman in the mirror was still sad. Her eyes still held a shadow of the hurt, but she was also determined. She was a waitress, an artist, a survivor. She was Olivia, and she was finally coming home to herself. The diner was my anchor to normalcy. Returning to work was less about the money and more about the routine. The familiar smell of coffee and grease, the rhythmic clatter of dishes, the predictable chaos of the lunch rush. It was a script I knew by heart, and for a few hours a day I could stop being the woman whose life had fallen apart and just be Olivia, the waitress. I could smile at customers, refill coffees, and focus on the simple math of making change. My coworkers tiptoed around me at first, their glances filled with a pity I couldn't stand. But eventually, the demands of the rush took over and things settled into a new, quieter version of normal. The meet cute, as they call it, was nothing like in the movies. There was no spilled latte, no bumping into each other on a street corner. It was, instead, a product of my own fledgling attempt to rebuild a life. My ancient, neglected laptop, which I'd only used for streaming shows and paying bills, finally gave up its ghost with a pathetic whirring sound and a blank screen. Panic set in immediately. How would I look for a better apartment? How would I manage my bank account? The feeling of helplessness was a familiar, unwelcome ghost. But the new, determined part of me pushed it aside. I Googled computer repair shops near me, found one with decent reviews called Tech Haven, and made an appointment for my next day off. Tech Haven was a small, cluttered shop tucked between a dry cleaner and a laundromat. A bell chimed above the door as I walked in, holding my dead laptop like a wounded animal. The air smelled of ozone and soldering iron. The walls were lined with shelves of old motherboards, tangles of cables, and dusty monitors displaying screensavers. A young man with bright green hair and multiple facial piercings looked up from behind the counter. "Help you? I have an appointment," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet space. "For Olivia? My laptop? It just died." "Right, yeah. Eric's helping you. He's just in the back." "Let me get him." He disappeared through a bead curtain into a back room. I stood there, nervously shifting my weight from one foot to the other, taking in the organized chaos of the place. It felt like the antithesis of my sterile apartment, a place where broken things were fixed, not discarded. Then he emerged. He wasn't what I expected. I suppose I'd pictured someone who looked like the guy with green hair, just older. But Eric looked kind. He was probably in his early 40s, with warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners and a gentle smile. He was wearing a simple blue t-shirt with the shop's logo and had a pair of reading glasses perched on his head. He looked capable, steady. "Hi, you must be Olivia," he said, his voice calm and low. "Let's see the patient." He reached out and took the laptop from me with careful hands, his fingers brushing against mine for a brief second. He placed it on the counter and opened the lid, pressing the power button. Nothing. He hummed thoughtfully, not a sound of frustration, but of curiosity. Okay, no signs of life at all. Let's plug it in, see if it's just the battery that's given up the ghost. As he worked, attaching the power cord, he asked easy, non-intrusive questions. "Anything important on here? Did you back up your data?" I don't know," I admitted, feeling foolish. "Photos, mostly. Some documents. I never really thought about it. Most people don't until it's too late," he said, not judgmentally, just stating a fact. "We'll see what we can recover. The hard drive might be okay even if the motherboard is fried." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and his expression softened. "Don't worry, we'll figure it out. It's what we do here." There was a profound kindness in his assurance. It wasn't a sales pitch, it was a genuine promise. He wasn't just talking about the laptop. In that moment, in that cluttered shop that smelled like hope and fixed things, I felt a knot of anxiety in my stomach begin to loosen for the first time in months. He didn't know my story, he didn't know my pain, but he saw a person in distress and his instinct was to comfort, to fix. The laptop, as it turned out, was a lost cause. The motherboard was indeed fried. But Eric managed to salvage the hard drive, transferring all my photos and documents onto a sleek, new external drive. "It's like a lifeboat for your data," he explained, handing it to me. "Now you can get a new laptop, and everything will be right where you left it." I wanted to cry, but this time from relief. He had saved my memories. He had taken something broken and salvaged what was most important. As I was paying, he wrote his personal cell number on the back of the shop's business card. "If you have any trouble transferring everything to a new computer, just give me a call. No charge for tech support over the phone." He smiled again, and it reached his eyes. I walked out of Tech Haven holding the small external drive. It felt heavy with significance. It wasn't just data. It was my past, saved by a kind stranger, and it was now mine to carry into whatever future I chose to build. The sun felt warmer on my face. The world seemed a little less hostile. The plot had twisted, not with drama, but with a simple, quiet act of competence and kindness. I didn't know it yet, but my upgrade had just begun. A week passed after my trip to Tech Haven. The new external drive sat on my coffee table, a tiny black monolith containing my past. I'd bought a new, surprisingly affordable laptop, but I was terrified to plug the drive in. What if it didn't work? What if all those photos were corrupted, lost in some digital void? The fear felt irrational, but it was tied to a deeper anxiety, the fear of confronting the life I'd lost. I stared at the drive and then at the business card with Eric's number. "No charge for tech support over the phone," he'd said. It felt like a lifeline. My hand shook slightly as I picked up my phone. I typed out a message, deleted it, then typed it again. "Hi Eric, this is Olivia from the other day. The laptop is great, but I'm a bit nervous about transferring the data. Any tips?" I hit send before I could overthink it. The 3 dots appeared almost immediately, and a wave of relief washed over me. "Hey Olivia, sure thing. It's pretty straightforward, but it can feel daunting. If you're free now, I can talk you through it step by step." And so, right there on my couch, with my phone on speaker, Eric guided me through the process. His voice was patient and clear, never condescending. "Nitries asked Astery. Okay, now plug the USB-C end into the port on the left. Yeah, that one. You should see a little icon pop up on your screen. See it? Great, now, just drag that folder named Users to your new desktop." Easy, and it was easy. With his calm instructions, the daunting task became a simple series of clicks. Within minutes, all my files were safely on the new computer. "You're a natural," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Thanks to my teacher," I replied, and I realized I was smiling too. A real, genuine smile that felt unfamiliar on my face. There was a comfortable pause. I could hear the faint sounds of the shop in the background, a printer whirring, the green-haired guy talking to a customer. "Listen," Eric said, his tone shifting slightly, becoming a little more hesitant. "I know this is probably way out of left field, and please feel free to say no, but I was about to take my lunch break. There's a great little bookstore cafe a few doors down. If you're not busy, I could buy you a coffee? As a celebration for the successful data migration. He rushed the last part out, and the awkwardness was so endearing it made my heart ache in a new, different way. I should have said no. I was a mess. I was a divorced waitress who cried at commercials and had only recently stopped eating ice cream for dinner. I wasn't ready. But the memory of his kindness in the shop, his patience on the phone, and the sound of his warm voice pushed me past the fear. A coffee sounds really nice, actually, I heard myself say. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from him in a cozy corner of the cafe, surrounded by the smell of old books and fresh coffee. I was nervous, my hands clasped tightly around my mug. This was my first time sitting across from a man who wasn't Mark in over a decade. The silence wasn't awkward, though. He seemed content to just sip his coffee and let me settle. "So, you're a hero who saves people's digital lives," I said, finally finding my voice. "That's a pretty cool job." He laughed, a warm, rich sound. "I don't know about hero. More like a digital janitor. But I like it. I like fixing things. Making stuff work again." He looked around the cafe. "I come here most days for lunch. It's my quiet time. I'm kind of a book nerd." "What kind of books?" I asked, genuinely curious. And that's when I saw it. The first green flag. His face lit up. He didn't give me a pretentious list of high literature. He got excited. "Okay, don't judge me," he said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "But I have a huge weakness for ridiculously detailed historical fiction. Like, give me a 1,000-page book about the daily life of a Roman sandal maker and I'm a happy man." He blushed a little, as if embarrassed by his own passion. I couldn't help but laugh. A Roman sandal maker? Seriously? Hey, someone had to make them, he defended himself, smiling. I love getting lost in other worlds. And I love that books are these quiet, steady things. They don't need updates or new operating systems. They just are. It was the most unassuming, genuine quirk. He wasn't trying to impress me. He was just sharing a piece of himself. And then came the second, brighter green flag. He asked about me, not just a polite, "What about you?" but real questions. He asked about my drawing, noticing the faint smudge of graphite on my index finger. When I told him I was a waitress, he didn't look dismissive. He asked what the funniest thing that happened at the diner was. I found myself telling him about the time a customer tried to order a sunny side-up steak, and we both laughed until we had tears in our eyes. And then it happened. A sappy, orchestral version of a pop song came on over the cafe's speakers. I barely noticed it, but Eric did. He stopped laughing, and his eyes got a little misty. He looked down at his coffee cup, a slightly embarrassed smile on his face. "Ah, man, this song gets me every time." "What is it?" I asked. "It's from this cheesy movie my mom loved," he said, not afraid to admit it. Always and Forever. It's terrible. The acting is awful, the plot makes no sense, but there's this one scene at the end where the dad finally tells his son he's proud of him. And this song plays. I don't know, it gets me right here, he tapped his chest. Every single time. It's so dumb. He wasn't afraid to be vulnerable. He wasn't afraid to show emotion and own it. In that moment, sitting in a bookstore cafe with a man who cried at sappy commercials and loved books about Roman sandal makers, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very, very long time. I felt safe. He wasn't a rebound. He wasn't a distraction. He was just a good man. And that was the greenest flag of all. Our first official date was a Saturday. Eric suggested the flea market on the outskirts of town, a sprawling, sun-drenched maze of treasures and junk. It was perfect. There was no pressure of a fancy dinner, no dim lighting that demanded intense, intimate conversation. It was just sunshine, dust, and the chaotic hum of hundreds of people browsing. He met me at the entrance, holding 2 coffees. "I didn't know how you took it," he said, handing me one. "So it's black. I figured you could doctor it up yourself if needed. Less chance of me getting it wrong that way." It was such a simple, thoughtful thing. A gesture that respected my autonomy instead of assuming my preferences. It was another green flag, quietly planted. We wandered for hours. I learned that Eric's idea of a good time was not just reading about history, but touching it. He'd get ridiculously excited over a box of rusted old tools or a stack of vintage postcards. He'd hold up a completely unrecognizable piece of metal and say, I think this might be part of a 1950s lawnmower engine. Look at the craftsmanship. His enthusiasm was infectious. I found myself smiling not at the objects, but at him, at the pure, unadulterated joy he found in the most unexpected places. I pointed to a booth filled with faded board games. Now that's my kind of history. I was a Monopoly tycoon as a kid. Ruthless. His eyes lit up. A challenger appears. We have to settle this. Find the most complete, most ridiculously old-looking set they have. We spent 20 minutes digging through boxes until we found a battered copy of Clue from the 1970s, the box held together with yellowing tape. Perfect, Eric declared, purchasing it without a second thought. Our first official board game. Colonel Mustard awaits. Later, we found a quiet spot under a large oak tree at the edge of the market, sitting on the grass. He opened the box with the reverence of an archaeologist. The pieces were all there, the cards slightly soft at the edges from decades of use. We played, and we argued. We argued passionately, hilariously, about whether it was possible for Professor Plum to have done it in the library with the wrench based on the flimsiest of circumstantial evidence. He accused me of cheating. I accused him of being a sore loser. We were both laughing so hard we could barely breathe. It was the most fun I'd had in years. It was silly, it was simple, and it was utterly, completely us. That became our new normal. Our happiness wasn't built on grand, romantic gestures. It was built in the small, uniquely us moments. Our perfect weekend wasn't about fancy dates or expensive trips. It was about connection. It was about attempting to bake an elaborate rainbow layer cake from a recipe we found online, and failing spectacularly, ending up with lopsided layers and icing that was somehow both too sweet and not sweet enough. We ate it anyway, sitting on my kitchen floor, covered in frosting, laughing at our own incompetence. It was about building elaborate blanket forts in my living room, using every sheet and pillow I owned. We'd curl up inside with his laptop arguing over what to stream. He'd want a documentary about the Industrial Revolution. I'd want a mindless reality show. We'd compromise on a historical drama, and he'd whisper fun facts in my ear about the accuracy of the costumes, and I wouldn't even mind. He introduced me to his world. I'd spend quiet afternoons at Tech Haven, sketching the clutter of components while he worked, the steady hum of his soldering iron a soothing soundtrack. He'd explain what he was doing, not in condescending technical jargon, but in simple, beautiful metaphors. See this? It's like a tiny bridge for electricity. It broke, so the message couldn't get across. I'm just rebuilding the bridge. I started to see the world through his eyes, not as a series of broken things, but as a series of puzzles waiting to be solved. I introduced him to mine. He started coming to the diner for late-night grilled cheese sandwiches after my shift, sitting at the counter and chatting with me while I wiped it down. My coworkers, who had seen me at my worst, would give me discreet thumbs up and smiles when his back was turned. He never made me feel like my job was less than his. He just seemed to enjoy being a part of my world. It was slow. It was careful. There were nights when the old pain would resurface, a sudden, sharp memory that would make me go quiet. Eric never pushed. He'd just sit with me in the quiet, or he'd tell me a ridiculously detailed fact about the history of concrete until I couldn't help but smile. He was building a new foundation with me, brick by steady brick, and it felt more solid than anything I'd ever known. It wasn't a frantic, passionate rebound. It was a gentle, steady sunrise after a long, long night. We were building a new normal, and it was weirder and infinitely better than anything I could have imagined. The dream was always the same. I'm standing in the kitchen of our old house, the one I fled months ago. The sun is streaming through the window over the sink, just like it always did in the mornings. Mark is there, making coffee. He turns and smiles at me, and for a moment, everything is as it was. Comfortable, familiar, safe. Then, the scene fractures. His smile doesn't reach his eyes. The coffee pot overflows, black liquid spreading across the counter like a stain, but he doesn't notice. He's looking at his phone, and his smile is now for someone else. I try to speak, to call his name, but no sound comes out. The room grows dark, and I am utterly, completely alone. I'd wake with a start, my heart hammering against my ribs, the ghost of that loneliness clinging to me like a shroud. I had this dream again after a particularly perfect day with Eric. We'd spent the afternoon hiking, and he brought his fancy camera, not to take posed pictures of us, but to photograph interesting fungi on fallen logs and the way the light hit the canyon walls. He saw beauty in details I would have missed. That night, we built a fort and ate pizza inside it. It was silly and wonderful, but the dream still came. I woke up gasping, the remnants of the nightmare's isolation still icy in my veins. The digital clock on the nightstand read 4017 EM. The studio was dark and silent. Eric was asleep beside me, his breathing deep and even. In the faint light from the window, I could see the steady rise and fall of his chest. The old fear, the one that had been my constant companion for so long, whispered in my ear, "You are alone. You will always be alone. This is all just temporary." The urge to retreat was powerful. To build the walls back up, to protect myself from the inevitable hurt. I could slip out of bed, go into the other room, and wait for the sun to rise alone. It was a familiar dance, a painful but safe routine. I started to move, to pull the covers back. Then Eric stirred. Still mostly asleep, he murmured something incoherent. His hand, which had been resting on his own chest, reached out across the sheets until it found my arm. His fingers curled around my wrist, not in a grip of possession, but in a soft, grounding hold. A simple, unconscious act of connection. He let out a soft sigh of contentment and settled back into deep sleep, holding on to me. And in that moment, the final twist of my heart occurred. It wasn't a dramatic revelation. It was a quiet, absolute certainty that settled deep into my bones. The climax of my story wasn't about Mark anymore. It wasn't about the betrayal or the pain. It wasn't even about overcoming it. It was about this choice, right here, in the dark. My biggest fear had always been being alone. I had built a life with Mark to avoid that fear, and when that life crumbled, the fear became my entire world. I thought a new relationship would be the antidote, a shield against that loneliness. But as I lay there, feeling the warm weight of Eric's hand on my wrist, listening to his quiet breath, I understood. It wasn't that Eric was stopping me from being alone. It was that, with him, I wasn't afraid of it anymore. He wasn't a need, he was a choice. A daily, conscious choice I made because he made my weird post-heartbreak life a million times more fun. He didn't try to fix my broken parts. He just accepted them as part of the landscape of me, like the interesting fungi on a log flawed, but still worthy of attention. The fear didn't magically vanish, but its power over me did. I carefully lay back down, turning onto my side to face him. I didn't wake him, I just watched him sleep in the dim light. This man who cried at sappy commercials, who got excited about Roman sandal makers and broken motherboards, who built blanket forts without a hint of self-consciousness. He wasn't perfect, but he was perfectly right for me. I realized then that the upgrade wasn't trading my old husband for a new, better model. The upgrade was within myself. It was the courage to be vulnerable again. It was the strength to choose happiness even when fear whispered its old warnings. It was understanding that being alone was a possibility, but with Eric, it was never a probability. He chose me, every day, in 1,000 small ways. And I chose him. I closed my eyes, focusing on the feeling of his hand on my wrist, a gentle tether to the present, to reality, to love. The dream's icy grip finally loosened. The silence of the room was no longer empty, it was peaceful. It was shared. For the first time since my life had tilted off its axis, I felt not just okay, but truly, deeply secure. Not because my life was perfect, but because I was no longer building it on the fear of being alone. I was building it on the choice to be together, and that made all the difference. The sun would rise soon and there would be coffee and probably a debate over what to have for breakfast. There would be more flea markets, more failed cakes, more board game arguments. There would be life. And for the first time in a long time, I couldn't wait for it to begin. The text message arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, a mundane day that was suddenly ripped open. I was at Eric's shop, sketching a jumbled pile of vintage camera parts he'd just acquired. The sun was warm through the front window and the green-haired kid, Leo, was humming along to the radio. Peace. Then my phone buzzed on the counter. It was from Mark. Olivia. I know I have no right to ask, but can we talk? I need to see you. I miss you. The words on the screen were like a sudden plunge into ice water. My entire body went cold, then hot. The peaceful atmosphere of the shop vanished, replaced by the dizzying sensation of the past reaching out its hand to drag me back. My breath hitched. I hadn't heard from him in months. I'd almost convinced myself he was a ghost. Eric looked up from the camera he was cleaning. He saw my face immediately. "Hey," he said, his voice soft with concern. He put down his tools and came around the counter. "What's wrong? You're white as a sheet." I couldn't speak. I just turned the phone screen toward him. I watched his face as he read the message. His expression didn't change to anger or jealousy. It just softened with a deep, knowing concern. He didn't snatch the phone away or tell me what to do. He simply placed a hand over mine. "Breathe, Olivia, just breathe." "I don't know what to do," I whispered, my voice trembling. The old, familiar panic was rising, the feeling of being trapped, of having my newfound peace threatened. A part of me, a small, wounded part, wondered if I owed him a conversation. 11 years had to be worth something, didn't they? "You don't have to do anything right now," Eric said, his voice a steady anger. "You can just sit with it. There's no rush." But the message had already done its damage. It was a ghost at the feast, a cold draft in the warm room. For the rest of the day, I was distracted, my mind pulled back into the labyrinth of my old marriage. I kept remembering the good times, the lazy Sunday mornings, the inside jokes, the way he'd always known how I took my coffee. The pain of the betrayal got all mixed up with a strange, sentimental grief for what I'd lost. It was incredibly confusing. Later that evening, at my apartment, I was quiet. Eric made us dinner, a simple pasta, and didn't push me to talk. He just let me be with my thoughts. Finally, over a cup of tea, I broke the silence. Part of me feels like I should see him. Just to close the door properly. But another part of me is terrified. Eric nodded, stirring his tea slowly. "That makes complete sense. 11 years is a long time. It's not a switch you can just flip off." He looked at me, his gaze steady and kind. "Whatever you decide, I want you to know something. I'm not going anywhere. This doesn't change anything between us. My only concern is you, and what you need to do to find your own peace." His words were the exact opposite of what I'd expected. I'd braced for insecurity, for an ultimatum, for the kind of pressure I was so used to. But he gave me none of that. He gave me unconditional support and a safe space to make my own choice. It was the most empowering thing anyone had ever done for me. "What if I see him and it sets me back?" I asked, voicing my deepest fear. "Then you set yourself back," he said simply, "and then you'll move forward again. You've done it before. You're the strongest person I know, Olivia. You survived the earthquake. This is just an aftershock. You've got this." The next day, I texted Mark back. "I'll meet you. For coffee. One time only." I chose a public place, a neutral cafe I'd never been to with Eric. I wore a simple sweater and jeans. Nothing he would remember me in. Voice it. I wasn't going for him. I was going for me. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a small table, nervously turning a coffee cup in his hands. He looked older, tired. He stood up when he saw me, a hopeful, pathetic smile on his face. "Olivia, you look good, thank you," I said, sitting down. My voice was calm, much calmer than I felt inside. The conversation was stilted and awkward. He talked about work. He asked about the diner. He said he'd been doing a lot of soul-searching. He said he missed me. He said he'd ended things with Chloe months ago. He said it was the biggest mistake of his life. The words were all there, the script of a man who wanted his old life back. I listened. I heard the regret in his voice, and a part of me felt sorry for him. But as I sat there, something became incredibly clear. The love I'd had for him felt like a story I'd read a long time ago, something familiar but distant, with no power over my present. The fear was gone. In its place was a calm, solid certainty. When he finished, I took a sip of my water. "Mark," I said, my voice even. "Thank you for saying that. I believe you're sorry, but I'm not the same person I was when I left. That door is closed. It's not out of anger. It's just fact." The hope drained from his face. "There's no chance, not even to try?" "No," I said gently but firmly. "There's no chance. This isn't my life anymore. I truly hope you find your happiness. But my peace, I've already found it." I stood up, leaving my full cup of coffee on the table. I didn't look back. I walked out of the cafe and into the sunlight. The ghost had been faced, and in the light of day it had no power. It was just a memory. I pulled out my phone and texted Eric. It's done, heading home. His reply was instant. I'll be there, proud of you. And I knew with every fiber of my being that I was finally, completely free. The air changed after my meeting with Mark. It was as if a storm that had been threatening on the horizon for months had finally passed, leaving the atmosphere clear, crisp, and charged with a new kind of potential. The ghost had been laid to rest. The aftershock, as Eric had called it, had subsided, and the ground beneath my feet felt more solid than ever. I had faced the past, and in doing so, I had fully arrived in the present. A few nights later, Eric and I were at his place, a small, comfortable house he owned on the quieter side of town. It was filled with books, half-finished projects, and a sense of warmth that my sterile studio had always lacked. We were in the middle of our new favorite weekend ritual, attempting to bake. Tonight's project was a lemon meringue pie, a ridiculously ambitious endeavor that had already resulted in a dusting of flour over every surface and a lemon zest incident we'd be finding evidence of for weeks. I was juicing lemons, my hands sticky and sour, while Eric was carefully whisking the meringue, his brow furrowed in concentration. A podcast about ancient Roman engineering played from his phone on the counter. It was chaotic, it was messy, and it was perfect. I looked at him, at the way his tongue poked out slightly when he was focused, and a wave of such profound, simple happiness washed over me that it stole my breath. What? He asked, catching me staring. A smudge of flour was on his cheek. Nothing, I said, smiling. I'm really happy. He stopped whisking and looked at me, really looked at me, his expression softening. Yeah? I put down the lemon. Meeting Mark, it was the best thing I could have done. It didn't make me miss him. It made me realize how much I don't. It made me realize that what I have here, with you, it's not a rebound. It's not a distraction from the pain. It's an upgrade. In every single way, the word hung in the air between us. Upgrade. It wasn't about him being a better man than Mark. It was about him being the right man for who I had become. He was the upgrade to my own life, to my own sense of self. Eric put the whisk down and came around the island to me. He took my sticky, lemon-scented hands in his. Olivia, he said, his voice low and serious. What we have, it's the realest thing I've ever known. I'm not here to be a replacement for anything. I'm here to build something new with you. Something better. He led me into the living room, away from the baking chaos. We sat on the couch, and he kept hold of my hand. I've been thinking, he began, a note of uncharacteristic nervousness in his voice. Your studio, it's fine. But it's not a home. It's a place you went to hide. And you're done hiding. He took a small key from his pocket and pressed it into my palm. It was warm from his skin. This is a key to this house, he said. I'm not asking you to move in tomorrow. There's no pressure. I want you to know that this is your home too, whenever you're ready. For a night, for a week, forever. The door is always open. I want you to have a place that feels like yours. That feels like us. I looked down at the key in my hand. It was just a piece of metal, but it felt heavier than anything I'd ever held. It wasn't a proposal, it was something more profound. It was an invitation. An invitation to fully step into this new life I had built. To choose it, consciously and completely, every single day. Tears welled in my eyes, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming love. This was the choice. Not a frantic, passionate leap, but a steady, deliberate step forward. He wasn't giving me a home, he was asking me to help him build ours. I'm ready, I whispered, closing my fingers around the key. I've been ready. He pulled me into a hug and I buried my face in his shoulder, breathing in the scent of flour, lemon, and him. The podcast was still playing in the kitchen, talking about the enduring strength of Roman arches, and it felt oddly fitting. We were building something with that same kind of strength, not on a foundation of fear or need, but on a foundation of choice, of friendship, of shared joy in the ridiculous and the simple. Later, our pie was a glorious, messy failure. The meringue wept, the filling was a bit runny, and the crust was slightly burnt on one edge. We ate huge slices of it on the couch anyway, and it was the most delicious thing I had ever tasted because we had made it together. The upgrade was complete. I-Day was complete. It wasn't about a perfect life. It was about a perfectly imperfect one, built on the choice to love and be loved every single day, Our happiness wasn't a grand, sweeping symphony. It was a quiet, comfortable melody we hummed together every day. Moving into Eric's house, our house, wasn't a dramatic event. It was a slow, gentle merging of two lives. My sketchbooks found a home on a shelf next to his history books. My few plates and mugs joined his mismatched collection in the cupboard. There was no heated debate over decor. It was an easy, unspoken collaboration. The house, once a quiet bachelor's retreat, now felt lived in, warm, and complete. Our life settled into a rhythm that was uniquely ours, a new normal, built not on grand passion but on deep, abiding companionship. Our perfect weekend truly was exploring flea markets. We became regulars, the couple who would eagerly dig through boxes of junk while other people slept in. Eric's eyes would light up when he found a vintage tool he could restore, and I started collecting old, beautifully illustrated children's books, their pages filled with stories and a history I loved imagining. We'd come home with our treasures, spread them out on the old wooden table in the garage, and spend the afternoon cleaning and admiring them. There was no goal, no rush. It was the shared joy of the hunt and the quiet satisfaction of preservation. Afterwards, we'd inevitably end up in the kitchen, attempting to bake something elaborate. Our failures were legendary. We once attempted a croquembouche that looked more like a spiky haystack and collapsed the moment we tried to move it. We didn't care. We sat on the floor with forks and ate the caramel-covered pastry puffs straight from the wreckage, laughing until our sides ached. And the blanket forts. They became our sacred space. Whenever one of us had a bad day or the world felt too heavy, the other would wordlessly start gathering blankets and pillows. We'd construct our little fortress of solitude in the living room, string up fairy lights, and curl up inside with a movie. It was our reset button. Inside that tent of quilts, the outside world ceased to exist. It was just us, sharing a bowl of popcorn, arguing playfully over whether to watch a documentary or a comedy, usually ending up with a cheesy action movie that made us both happy. It was in these small, mundane moments that I found a happiness more profound than any I had ever known. It was the happiness of being truly seen and accepted. Eric loved my weird post-heartbreak self. He loved that I could name every regular at the diner and their usual order. He loved my terrible drawings and proudly hung them on the refrigerator. He loved that I needed 5 minutes of absolute quiet with my coffee in the morning before I could form a coherent sentence. And I loved his quirks just as fiercely. I loved the way he got ridiculously excited explaining the engineering behind a simple zipper. I loved that he volunteered to fix the computers at the local animal shelter every other Saturday. I loved that he wasn't afraid to cry during a sappy movie and would then try to blame it on allergies. He was the most genuinely good man I had ever met, and his kindness was a quiet, steady force that healed the broken parts of me I thought were beyond repair. One Sunday morning, we were at the flea market. The sun was warm on our backs. Eric was deeply engrossed in a conversation with an older vendor about the merits of a particular type of vintage wrench. I wandered to a nearby stall filled with plants. And there it was, a succulent. But not a sad, struggling one like I'd had before. This one was vibrant and full, with plump green leaves that reached confidently for the sun. It was thriving. I bought it without hesitation. When I brought it back to Eric, he smiled. "A new one? A new one," I confirmed, holding the pot carefully. For the kitchen window. He put an arm around me, pulling me close and kissing the top of my head. We walked back to the car, his tool in one hand, my plant in the other. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The silence was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding of two people who had found their way home. This was the upgrade. Not a life without problems or past hurts, but a life with a partner who made facing them feel not just possible, but worthwhile. It was a traditional happiness, but it was built on a uniquely us foundation. A foundation of flea market treasures, failed baked goods, blanket forts, and a quiet, steady love that felt as enduring as the history he so loved to read about. I looked at the succulent, then at Eric, and I knew. This was my life now. And it was more than enough.